This is Tar Heel Talk, an in-depth look at the issues and people making news in North Carolina. Here's your host, Sonia Williams.
On March 21st, 1965, more than 2,000 people began the 54-mile march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. Led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the march sparked change in voting rights and equality for African Americans. And photojournalist Spider Martin walked along with the protesters, capturing powerful moments and images that brought international attention to the civil rights movement. And now, 51 years later, you can see his work on display at the North Carolina Museum of History in the exhibit Selma to Montgomery, A March for the Right to Vote, photographs by Spider Martin. And with us to tell us more about this exhibit is the curator with the North Carolina Museum of History, Earl Imes. Earl, welcome back to Tar Heel Talk.
Well, thank you for having me again.
1965, March in Selma, Alabama, is a pivotal point in our nation's history. Take us back to that time and what was happening in our country.
Well, it's important to note that this is the apex of the civil rights movement, so to speak, of the modern civil rights movement. And in particular, 1964, we need to go back because of the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And that was a bill that had come to fruition literally based on the platform of President John Kennedy that passed to the desk of President Lyndon Johnson after President Kennedy's assassination that came just 3 months after the August 1963 March on Washington, which many people know as and think of as that apex seminal moment. And so that leads to the passage of the non-discriminatory aimed at striking down segregation and Jim Crow in particular. But what it doesn't do is address the egregious attacks on voting against primarily Black Americans and primarily in the South and primarily in these districts where people of color were at or near majority voting blocks. So what this 1965 timeframe marks is a concerted effort by civil rights workers to register voters in the South. And of course it was met with massive resistance and Klan tyranny, and we've seen the images. So this march doesn't start to be the march from Selma to Montgomery, so to speak. It comes to fruition after the murder of a civil rights activist, Jimmy Lee Jackson, who was daring to register voters in Dallas County, Alabama. And his murder grew out of a protest to get Reverend Orange out of jail for also doing the same thing. And word had gotten to the youth that he was going to be lynched in jail. And so an impromptu march to preempt that lynching is in fact what led to the murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson. And then that murder is what the students at SNCC in particular, led by John Lewis, now Congressman John Lewis, was aimed at really saying this is the last straw. Enough is enough. We're Americans. We demand the right to vote, and we demand protection and an end to the tyranny that had been ongoing literally since the end of the Civil War.
Right, because really at the end of the Civil War, African Americans or freed people were given the right to vote, but over the course of several decades, obstacles were
You're exactly
created.
right. The Reconstruction Amendments, we call them, the 13th Amendment, which of course outlawed slavery in America, the 14th Amendment, which made citizens out of our freed ancestors, made them American citizens. And then the 15th Amendment, which was passed in 1870, February 1870, gave males of color, African American males, only the right to vote.
Okay.
Remember, the 20th Amendment had not been passed
Right.
yet, so that's not until 1920. So at this point, 1870, it dramatically transformed the political landscape, because what you find in the South in particular is these areas that had the largest plantations had the highest concentration of African Americans and also the most stringent slave control and customs. So it was a drastic change, literally in 5 years, for that population to go from enslavement to actually voting and gaining political power. And so the reaction draws in the Klan of the 1870s and persists Klan activity and later red shirt activity through what we call the Reconstruction, which of course Dr. King's speech at Selma alludes to this. One of Dr. King's most seminal moments, top 3 speeches of all time, is the speech. Most of us know it as the "How long, not long now" speech, but what he's talking about in 1965 is the 15th Amendment was passed 95 years ago, and we are still waiting for the right to vote. There was a small time frame in the 1870s primarily when freed people were gaining and achieving that privilege, American privilege to vote. But it was gradually curtailed until it was literally stamped out. And in the case here in our state, North Carolina, the 1901 Constitution basically nullified the 15th Amendment and created the poll taxes and those things which, of course, the protesters in 1965 in Selma, Alabama were protesting against. Those Jim Crow laws, the legal segregation that Dr. King speaks about in his speech at Selma, Alabama, that is.
So let's go to March 20, well, not even March 21st. Start with March 7th.
Yes, we're going to back up. March 7th is the first march organized by SNCC, John Lewis, the students, and it's
And tell us what SNCC is an acronym
I'm sorry, the
for.
Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was founded on the campus of Shaw University here in Raleigh, our nation's oldest historically black college and university. In 1960, SNCC was formed. And Dr. King was here several times recognizing the students, and particularly Ella Baker, for helping to start the SNCC chapter. So the students were a seminal part of the civil rights movement because they didn't have jobs to lose.
Right.
And a lot of them didn't have families. So it was not nearly as much of a burden as it was for older people with jobs and established who could be threatened with the backlash of losing their jobs or getting a Klan cross burned in their yard. So the students are the face for the large part. And then what happens, SNCC initiates this first march, and Spider Martin from the Birmingham News captures that 2-minute warning, is what it's called, what the Alabama State Troopers gave the marchers 2 minutes to disperse.
Right, and we have that photograph.
Yes.
That 2-minute warning photograph.
Yes, and
From Spider Martin's collection.
And at the front of the line is now Congressman John Lewis and Hosea Williams to his right. And of course, you see the legally enforced sanctions of Jim Crow and law enforcement literally enforcing Jim Crow and segregation and discrimination. And those were laws on the books in many of our states, southern states, including North Carolina. And these laws were enforced by public safety officers.
And with that, in that photograph, the 2-minute warning, I've read that they were given a 2-minute warning, and about a minute or so into that 2-minute warning,
it could be discussed ad nauseum whether or not it was a full 2 minutes. And I'm sure the protesters didn't think that it was a full 2 minutes. So I think that's somewhat depicted in the film Selma. We had the opportunity to premiere, well, to show the film at the premiere of the exhibit back on Labor Day. And one of several of the programs that goes along with the exhibit. But that first march, led by the students, became known as Bloody Sunday because it was televised live on Sunday evening news nationwide for people to see exactly what many of us had been experiencing all along in confronting the injustice of discrimination and Jim Crow segregation.
Absolutely. We're going to take a break. I want to talk more about Bloody Sunday and how that is depicted in this exhibit, and more about how you're sharing that with the public in just a minute.
Very good, thank you.
We'll be back with more on Selma to Montgomery, a right for the march to vote, after these messages. Photojournalist Spider Martin captured powerful images during the famous 1965 march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. His images brought international attention to the civil rights movement, and now they're on display at the North Carolina Museum of History in the exhibit Selma to Montgomery, a march for the right to vote. Photographs by Spider Martin. This exhibit is open now through June 7th, 2017, and to get more information about the exhibit, go to ncmuseumofhistory.org. And with us again is curator Earl Imes. Now, Earl, before the break, you had just started to talk about what has become known as Bloody Sunday.
Yes.
That first attempt to march from Selma to Montgomery on March 7th of 1965.
That is correct. That Bloody Sunday is the majority of the images that are depicted on that first day, and they are powerful. They literally show what the effects of going up against the legal system of segregation resulted in. But this was also part of the strategy of the civil rights marchers, was to insist on nonviolence, but to also insist that these images, that people in the outside world see what many in the South, in particular in the Black community, knew was going on a daily basis to enforce segregation. So Spider Martin played a pivotal role, and Dr. Martin Luther King acknowledged him as such for doing that. So that March 7th, Sunday, March 7th, Bloody Sunday, resulted in the SNCC-led march. And once those images came out, people galvanized literally all over the country, and Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, his organization, or the adults, so to speak, come in. And there's been talk and study about how it was somewhat of a friction with the SCLC coming in and taking over. But it was later acknowledged by SNCC that it was probably the best move, and to have Dr. King be the face of it and to handle the sheer weight of that moment. And so Dr. King came in and immediately began to organize a second march. And turns out that the county and the state required a permit, and he made a decision that he was going to march anyway, against the wishes of the courts, and particularly against the wishes of President Lyndon Johnson. So King, at the last moment, he starts the march on the second march, and at the last moment, right before being given the 2-minute warning, he kneels and prays at the Edmund Pettus Bridge and turns around. Very powerful moment, and obviously spirit-led, because Dr. King didn't know and didn't plan to do that originally, and evidently it was something that welled up and caused him to be spirit-led and turn around and literally obey the court order until the permit could be issued. And so the permit was in fact issued, and the third march took place on March 21st, that Sunday, and of course culminated on March 25th with Dr. King and Coretta Scott King, who had come to join him by that time for this particular march. And Spider Martin captured the iconic image of those two embraced arm in arm with other freedom seeking civil rights, marching literally into Montgomery, the state capital of Alabama.
And that photograph is in his exhibit.
It is. And as they're entering Montgomery, they're singing freedom songs like "We Shall Overcome." And so that is also in the exhibit that you'll experience. As you're going through the exhibit, you will get to hear these songs that were called civil rights songs from the 50s and 60s. Some are earlier, of course, earlier Negro spirituals. So there, in fact, were 3 different marches, and the third march, which is fully endorsed by President Lyndon Baines Johnson, and where he sent the Alabama National Guard to ensure protection of the marchers, and it was highly coordinated. And so the judge, in this case, I like to cite as a hero of the civil rights, because it was very courageous for a white judge in the South to actually do that and rule in favor of these marchers 50 years ago. So it took a lot of people, as Dr. King acknowledged, to make the civil rights movement happen. And you can see these images, as well as the image of the marchers at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. There's a sign from Hawaii there in the group. And when you look closely at the photographs, it's an array of races, ages, sexes. And one person in particular that we like to point out is Jim Leatherer. He's a one-legged cancer survivor who marched the entire 54-mile journey on one leg. And he kept the spirits up of everybody on the march by chanting left, 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 as he's marching literally on his only leg, that left leg. So there are those types of stories, and then there are also the stories of the people who lost their lives there, and you'll see that in the exhibit as well. But the third march and final march is what galvanized the nation and led directly to that culmination of Dr. King at the side of President Lyndon Baines Johnson in the August 1965 signing of the Voting Rights Act, which is very powerful because up to this point, if you were a person of color in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, the states where we had these majority black belt districts is what they're referred to, you had to overcome a lot of barriers to vote. There was in our Constitution, the 1901 Constitution, the grandfather clause. Well, if you lived in 1901 and your grandfather voted, then you could vote. Well, of course, how many freed ancestors who were enslaved could do that? So that was one way. Literacy tests, reciting the Constitution, a poll tax, where you would have to pay a tax to go and vote and or register to vote, depending on what state or county you're in. And then once you pay those polls, if you didn't pay 1 year, you had to pay in the arrears. So it was an outrageous system that even got to the point where if you could pay your poll tax, then you got the privilege to go before the county magistrate and recite the preamble to the Constitution.
Insurmountable obstacles.
And then once that happens, then you get to register your name and address in the voter polls so that the Klan can come and burn a cross in your yard. So these obstacles to voting, to that basic American right for all people, is what the 1965 Voting Rights Act accomplished.
Okay, we're going to take another break. We'll talk more in just a minute.
Thank you.
We'll be back with more Tar Heel Talk after these messages. Welcome back to Tar Heel Talk. I'm Sonia Williams. In 1965, photojournalist Spider Martin captured images of the famous march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. His images then brought international attention to the civil rights movement, and they are now on display at the North Carolina Museum of History. And here to tell us more about this is the curator, Earl Imes. He's with the North Carolina Museum of History. Earl, Spider Martin was, not only did he capture such a crucial moment in our history, he really helped to shed light on what was for a long time a very ugly, dark secret,
Well,
especially in the South.
It was a secret to outsiders who didn't know, but to people who lived in the South, this is one of the main reasons why many African Americans fled the South and moved north or out west is because of these outrageous circumstances. But Spider Martin is acknowledged, rightfully so, by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as a civil rights pioneer for having captured these images. And Spider Martin was a photojournalist with the Birmingham News. We'd like to give them credit also, as well as the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute for loaning us this exhibit. Spider Martin got his nickname Spider, because he was a smaller guy, 5'2", about 125 pounds, and he could literally crawl in trees or crawl on top of trucks or get into crevices and get the most unique angles on his photography. And you'll see that when you really explore photography, aside from the images itself, you can see the genius of his photography and the angles and how he was really able to enhance what was going on through his photography. But you're correct. These images were necessary because we needed outrage from all America against this really crime against humanity is what Jim Crow was, nothing less. And so Spider Martin was very courageous as a white male in the South to buck the system and actually capture these images. And so when you come to the exhibit, you'll see a panel that's kind of in memoriam of Spider Martin and acknowledging just that. But people like him, white, black, Indians, all affected civil rights and equality for everyone. And again, the civil rights movement not only benefited African Americans, it benefited everyone in our community. And as Dr. King rightly stated, we are only as strong as our weakest link. And when we had a legal system of Jim Crow and secondary citizenship, that really made all of us secondary citizens.
As you look through the photographs in the exhibit and think about what the protesters were marching for, fast forward to present day, 2016 upcoming elections, how do you convey the importance of voting to our younger generation who is so far removed from 1965?
Well, thank you. That's an excellent question. First of all, if you don't vote, you have no right to complain about anything because you're not participating in the democratic process that people, as you'll see in this exhibit, and this is not the only instance. This has just happened to be captured and orchestrated after many years of demanding voting rights. So the younger generation needs to understand the sacrifice, the blood, the sweat, the tears, the people who died so that we all, black, white, Indian, all American citizens can have that American right to vote and participate in the democratic process in this country, which is, as President Reagan said, a shining light on city on the hill and the light of the world. And for us in this country to take that for granted is just as egregious as these Alabama state troopers trying to keep these people 50 years ago from registering to vote and affect their future, particularly in your local community. A lot of us get fixated on presidential elections, but our local communities are really what we should educate ourselves and focus on and go and vote and participate in the American democracy.
And this exhibit, Selma to Montgomery, is going to be on display now at the Museum of History up through June 7th of next year, and people can go to the website to find out more information. Earl Imes, it's always a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for sharing this information with us today.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you.
All right. I'm Sonia Williams. Thanks so much for watching. Have a wonderful week.